All right, so Anthony Smith recently started up his new podcast called On Paper with Anthony Smith. No, I am not kidding, and honestly, this podcast is really bad. But before I start talking about what makes his podcast as hard to watch as his UFC fights, it's important that we review how and why this podcast came to be in the first place. So as many of you probably know, Anthony Smith was the regular co-host of Michael Bisping's Believe You Me podcast for a little over 2 years. And if you want me to be real, BYM was never really my cup of tea, and that's mainly because I just don't think that Bisping and Smith were ever really an entertaining duo. Don't get me wrong, I actually like Michael Bisping as a host just fine. I actually think he's much better suited as a content creator than he is as a fight commentator by a mile. And at the risk of sounding like a massive dick, I've always felt like Anthony Smith was always dragging BYM down. Smith is just not an entertaining personality, but in a weird way, I actually think that he's kind of the opposite of Bisping, where I think that Anthony is better suited as a stuffy desk analyst than he is as a podcaster. Anthony always speaks in a bored, monotone voice. The guy always looks like he was about to fall asleep whenever it wasn't his turn to talk, and I never felt like Smith and Bisping had great chemistry together, but obviously that's a subjective opinion. Regardless, in spite of my own personal issues with their show, these guys grinded the YouTube game for more than 2 years together, and along the way they ran up over 200,000 subscribers as well as over 20 million views. Look, their style personally wasn't for me, but it's hard to deny that they had a good amount of loyal viewers that tuned in to watch whenever they dropped a new episode. But it seems like there was trouble in paradise, because during the summertime of last year, Anthony started showing up less and less frequently on the show, and fans began to take notice, making people wonder if there was some sort of falling out between the two. But as they say, there's a silver lining to everything, because with the absence of Smith, Michael Bisping then brought on Paul Felder to be his new regular co-host, and I gotta say, this was a massive upgrade. Anyways, after a couple of months of Felder becoming a more prominent addition to BYM, and with Smith being seen once every couple of weeks, Bisping finally revealed to fans why Anthony was no longer a part of the show.
But with his schedule, with fighting and working ESPN and stuff, he wasn't here some of the time, and other times I would have to get you to fill in. And then, he went through a tough time. He lost a friend and a coach, and then he lost his fight. And we were just waiting for him. We were leaving him to it, because that would usually be the process. If he lost a fight, he would take a week or two off and stuff like that. And we just never heard from him. And then all of a sudden we just saw that he was doing his own podcast somewhere else. So that's it. That's the story. There's no big fallout. There's no drama. There's no beef. I wish him nothing but the best. And I truly mean that. I was a little bit shocked when I just was scrolling YouTube one day and I saw the On Paper podcast, but God bless him. Good for him. I wish him nothing but the best. So there it is. There's your fucking drama, guys. Because I know, what happened? What happened? Nothing. Literally from my side, fuck all. I'm like, where is he? That's about it.
Honestly, I do believe Bisping when he says that he has no ill will towards Anthony for going off and starting his own podcast. I mean, at the end of the day, dude, these are fully grown men and they're professional MMA fighters, so the idea of them beefing over another man deciding to do his own YouTube podcast would actually be pretty pathetic. But even still, I really do think it's poor form out of Smith to outright ghost Bisping the way that he did and not even give him a simple heads up that he's leaving BYM. And it's like, I don't blame Anthony for wanting to forge his own path and be the lead of his own show. I think it's pretty natural for someone who's been the supporting member of a podcast for so long to want to become the main character. The issue is that he ghosted one of his friends for weeks, all while he was obviously getting his new show set up. I'm glad that Bisping is taking the high road about this situation and all, especially given how much of a hothead he was while he was competing, but even he can't hide the fact that he was shocked when he saw that his long-standing co-host just went and started his own podcast after weeks of trying to get in contact with him. And look, obviously I'm not going to say that Anthony is an evil person for leaving a side hobby, but at a very basic level, I do think that what Smith did to Bisping was a little shady, and the shady nature of his actions would have been entirely avoided if he just sent this guy a text saying that he's leaving BYM. Honestly, I think it's kind of weird that a grown man like Anthony didn't show his friend and longtime co-host enough respect to give him any form of notification that he was removing himself from the show, but it is what it is. Okay, now with all this being said, check out Anthony's explanation as to why he ghosted Bisping and left BYM.
I guess with that said, first of all, there is Michael Bisping and I have no beef. We're good. Full disclosure, I'm a really bad communicator. Scotty dies, and for everyone giving me so much shit, you got to give me a break here. I had one of the most traumatic things that's ever happened to me happened. What I should have done was reach out and say, hey, I see Paul's been on the show. What's the plan here? Is it him or do you want me back? That's what I should have done. Sure. But that's just not what I'll own that. That's what I should have done. You
kind of jumped to a conclusion and
I think
ran with it in a way.
And it wasn't even an angry thing. It's his show. If you want me to be on your show, then that, and that's how my brain worked. If you want me on the show, then he'll reach out. And he just didn't. So I had no animosity. There was no anger. There was no like, I don't know. I still love Mike and I still love Paul. Like there was nothing. It was just they had been on doing their thing for several weeks. It seemed to be going really well. And I just assumed like the BYM moved on from Anthony, and that's fine.
But bro, this guy Anthony Smith really left a successful podcast only to make what I fully consider the worst MMA podcast that's hosted by a UFC fighter that I've ever seen. And the thing is, it's a podcast. It's not a very hard thing to set up properly. The camera that he uses is good, his mic is fine, and he's well spoken enough to carry on a conversation. But my god, it's just so fucking boring. And I seriously can't wrap my head around the sheer amount of delusions that convinced him to think that he had the personality, charisma, or likability to run his own show. And hey, self-awareness has always been Anthony's weakest character trait by a country mile, so I guess I shouldn't be all that shocked that he really thought that he of all people could make content that's entertaining and worth tuning into. But lo and behold, Anthony Smith and his infamous delusions of grandeur have come out to play yet again with On Paper. First and foremost, I'm really confused at his choice of a co-host, because instead of choosing another known figure in the world of UFC or MMA, he instead picked this girl, Kelly Murphy, who I guess is his former producer on a previous podcast that he worked on. But it's kind of weird because in the very first episode of On Paper, she introduces Anthony as her better half.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to On Paper. I'm Kelly Murphy. More importantly, my better half, Anthony Smith, UFC light heavyweight, and the ultimate girl dad himself.
And usually when people refer to someone as their better half, they're referring to their husband or their wife, but in the case of these two, it seems like they're just friends and co-hosts, which I think is a very weird way to describe someone that you share a hobby with. But like, this girl, Kelly Murphy, is just a podcast producer, that's all she is. Like, she's not a fighter, she doesn't train MMA, she's not inside of the industry in any capacity. I don't get it, what value does she bring to On Paper that would make people want to watch it? Is she really the perfect choice to fill the charisma black hole that is Anthony Smith? In this vast landscape of MMA podcasts that are hosted by fighters, commentators, and coaches alike, the choice of having a co-host that has no working experience in the industry is so bizarre to me. And I know that I just said what I just said, but no bullshit, Kelly Murphy is actually so much easier to watch on this show than Anthony Smith is, and it's not even close. Kelly very clearly follows the sport, which is nice, but what she brings to the table that Smith can't seem to do is that she actually brings energy and enthusiasm to the conversation. She genuinely shows interest in the topics, trends, and news that are taking place in the sport. And even though she's not nearly a strong enough presence to keep me watching the podcast week in and week out, I can appreciate that she's carrying all of these conversations on her back. Meanwhile, Smith acts and talks like he'd rather be anywhere else. I'd like to point out what Smith says in the first episode as to why he started his own show.
And really just have a place to get out whatever I'm thinking about, whatever my feelings on a certain topic are. I think sometimes my view on the sport is a little bit different maybe than other people's.
Yeah, so if you've been watching On Paper, then you'd know that Smith straight up has the most generic takes ever. This guy seriously has no original or profound thoughts when it comes to the sport that he's a professional athlete in, and everything that he says when it comes to upcoming or previous fights are things that you've already heard people say already. All of his breakdowns and predictions are talking points that you've heard every other analyst say over and over again for years now. And again, it doesn't help that Anthony has the on-screen charisma of an ISIS hostage, so he doesn't at all try and dress up his boring analyses with any excitement or even just basic interest in what he's talking about. Smith is just not someone that a podcast should be centered around. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone because for years MMA fans have been making fun of him online for being a boring fighter that can't make people interested in watching his fights. Not only that, this guy has been memed to Kingdom Come for his delusional thoughts of himself for years now. If you simply Google Anthony Smith delusional, you will see dozens of videos dedicated to making fun of how disconnected from reality he is. And I seriously cannot fathom what convinced him that launching a podcast alongside somebody no one knows and with him at the front and center of the show would be a success. And obviously, with the weird split that he's had with Bisping and BYM, almost every single comment on every single episode of On Paper is calling out Smith for his shady departure. To an extent, I do kind of feel bad for the guy that this new project that he started is just getting unanimously hated on by the internet, but it's hard to say that all of these issues don't stem back to Anthony and his own actions. If he just gave Bisping the heads up that he's leaving BYM, then people wouldn't be nearly as hostile towards him, but to a greater extent, if this guy actually practiced some basic self-awareness, then he would have launched his own podcast alongside a noteworthy co-host that can balance out his lethargic personality. And you know what? After 2 years of co-hosting BYM with Bisping, then you would think that Smith would have learned a thing or two about charisma and being an engaging host. At the end of the day, this just seems like another example of delusional things that Smith does that he brings upon himself due to his sense of hubris and lack of self-awareness. I do think it's a bummer that his podcast has already crashed and burned right as it's left the station, but but at the same time, he only has himself to blame. And honestly, my critiques of On Paper are pretty fixable if he just used a little bit of introspection and asked himself what he can do to improve the viewing experience, but knowing Anthony, he's going to gaslight himself and blame everything in the world except for himself for people not wanting to watch his podcast. Anyways, that's the video for today. Definitely let me know what you think about Anthony Smith's newest foray into hosting his own show. Do you think that Smith knowingly snaked Bisping, and do you think that he can find success with On Paper? As always, if you liked the video, then like the video, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so. I appreciate you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.